course in history was developed, and it was called the Crash Course in Jewish History. They have a crash course in Hebrew and a crash course in philosophy. But the one that I like the most is this one, because for so many of us, our knowledge of Jewish history is pretty thin. We know names and we may know some places, but we don't remember dates very well, and we don't know how it all fits together very easily. And a lot of it has to do with how you define history and where does history begin. Because some people might say history begins all the way over here, and others may say history begins here, and some may say history begins over on this side of the timeline, because it just depends on how you define or what issues you feel are important in understanding what history is. It's very, very interesting. Bruce and I have been reading a text called the Kuzari, and a lot of it has to do with how do you prove something? What do you need to prove something? And over again it comes up with empirical evidence. So not when one person sees something or one person hears something, but when you have a mass vision or view or experience where you get more than one opinion that something actually happened. And so history is always looking for empirical evidence. And in religious history, we look for not only evidence within the system we're living in, but evidence from outside that system. So in order to say history begins, you have to find some evidence outside of your worldview that sees the same event and records it the same way, to say that then becomes some kind of historical moment. And when you do that, you begin to piece together this course of human history. So, I'm going to talk a little bit, before we begin, about time. Because according to the Jewish calendar, this is the year 5774. Now everyone always asks, so what is that in reference to? Where does that number come from? Why do we have that number? How do we count time? In other words, where did it begin? If there's a 5774, what's the year 0? And according to traditional Jewish understanding, if we counted back from this year through time, through all of these events, births and deaths, using the Torah or the Tanakh in general as our guide, then we would ultimately get back to the year 0 and the creation story. Now, how does that work? Come on, guys. You and I both know the world is more than 5,774 years old. That we have carbon dating of all kinds of things that go back hundreds or tens of millions of years. And in a scientific world where most of us live, that doesn't make sense then to say the world is 5,774 years. But let's just think for a moment that we're not talking about the world, but we're talking about a world view. In other words, the Jewish historical perspective, the engagement of Judaism in the world, the birth of monotheism, that have developed since that time go back in time, really, 5,774 years. And if you really look carefully at the beginning of the Torah, the King James translation of the Tanakh did a horrible number on our understanding of the years he wrote. Because that translation begins in the beginning, as if there was a place or a way to pinpoint the beginning of everything. And that's not the case in Judaism. We don't see the world that way. We don't even see the text that way. And the Hebrew itself doesn't lend into that, because the Hebrew says, in a beginning. Or better yet, as the JPS translation says, when God began to create the heavens and the earth. So what if we understood that before all of this took place, somewhere over here on this side of the timeline, there was the Big Bang, kaboom! And there was Darwinism, and survival of the fittest, and little bitty frogs turned into fish, and fish grew feet and began to walk the land, and lizards became dinosaurs, and all of that happened way over here. But then humanity entered the world. And when humanity entered the world, it began to have an experience. And at some point, a group of people, who that group of people is remains to be seen, had this concept that suddenly the world began, not from over here, ex nihilo, out of nothing, but out of something. And that something began to take shape in the form of a storyline. And so the history that we're going to be talking about is not all of this stuff, the dinosaurs and the fossils and the creatures that no longer exist. We're going to be talking about the birth of human consciousness and the engagement that at least a group of people had with the birth of their own tradition. And so then history becomes something else. And I love this word, and I've already said it a bunch since I've been here. The word is heterology. And heterology is defined as dissimilarity, unsimilarity, the quality of being dissimilar. In biology, it is the science of the study of human organisms in their dissimilarity to one another. And if we suggest, as I'm going to suggest, that Judaism is a heterology in the world of religion, and we're going to see the birth of Judaism defining itself as it is dissimilar to every other culture and people that exist at the same time. So what makes us unique, or what separates us from other cultures, becomes incredibly important in trying to define how Judaism is going to see history. And if we pay very careful attention to that vision, then what we begin to see is a unique grasp on the meaning of that history and how it moves us through not only periods of light, but mainly periods of darkness. One of my professors from Hebrew Union College, Alice Rivkin of blessed memory, used to say that Jewish history was a collection of radical mutations from one period of time to the next. In other words, you see a period of time, and then there's some kind of radical mutation that changes the direction. And then you see that grow a little bit. And then there's another radical mutation that again moves human history along a path. That instead of seeing history as a timeline, he saw it much more like a cardiogram with peaks and valleys and radical changes and yes, you're moving along a line, but it's not a flat line. And that as history rose and fell and these mutations took people to different directions, it really created a different understanding of the world and its worldview. So, keep in mind this term, dissimilarity, and we're going to look at some periods of human history, especially as we walk through what those in Torah study have heard me say, the non-history part of history. So if you tried to find a period of biblical history at which point you could draw a circle on the map and say, here's where there's evidence that something actually happened, that period of time is somewhere around 2800, or if we count it backwards, sometime around the Davidic kingdom, 1,000 years BC. And so, it's very hard looking this direction to find historically quantifiable moments. Now, there's been a lot of work done around Noah. Because everybody's looking all over creation for Stunkana Ark in the mountains of Turkey. And all they're finding is firewood. And the reality is, it probably never existed there. Or if it did, the guys on the ground used it to warm themselves because it's really cold in those mountains. And they pulled it all apart as they uncovered it or it uncovered itself. But there's a lot of secondary sources which talk about the flood. And they talk about, huge water and all-consuming floods. And there's other religious traditions that talk about flood events. But there's no real geological evidence that there was a huge flood. My family lived in Texas forever. And in 1900 was the big storm in Galveston. And my great-great-grandfather owned the dry goods store in Galveston, Texas. And it was a 3-story building. It was the tallest building in Galveston. And everything on the island was level. And the only thing left standing in all the photos of Galveston after the 1900 storm is his building. And the water line is 3/4 of the way up on the 3rd floor. And, everybody lost everything. But there was a water line. You could see the water line. 114 years later, you can still see the water line on the building. They purposefully never removed it. But there's no water line in the world. And we don't see that water line in the flood. And, what is the flood? Was it a cataclysmic global event? Or was it a regional rainstorm that washed out small villages where people were living? And they reported it. We see the flood as if the whole planet is consumed by water. But in reality, the worldview of the people at the time didn't extend much beyond their line of sight. And so their world was consumed by water. And they recorded it. So let's talk a little bit about our story. So when we look at biblical history as starting in the creation story, we know the creation story, God said, let there be certain things, and certain things came into being. The rabbinic perspective on the creation story is not that it was 6 days, just to confound this kind of approach a little bit more. They would say a day in God's sight, 1,000 years in God's sight are but as a day when it is past, or as a watch in the night. So they might say this creation story really belongs out here. 6,000 years the other direction. Or, if one is more traditional, a day is a day. And if we count those 6 days, and then the first generation, and we get to Adam, and then we go 10 more generations, and we get to Noah, and then we go 10 more generations, and we get to Abraham, that we begin this march through human time. So, what does Adam bring to the world? What does Adam bring to the world from a historical perspective?
Bashfulness.
Bashfulness. Bashfulness? Okay.
With the post on
Awareness of God.
Awareness of
One
God.
God. One God.
Okay. Adam brings us. Before Adam, we weren't here. Adam is the step that brings humanity into focus as history is now going to move through time. And so we need Adam. Because even though God creates humanity on the 6th day, humanity doesn't really get named in the first story of creation. It gets named in the second story of creation. Adam is given the authority then to name all the other things in creation, which we're not sure he ever does because he never talks about it. It just kind of happens. But Adam's presence is the birth of human consciousness. And then we see the progression from Adam to Noah. What does Noah bring to the world? If you remember back those days, a long time ago when you were in religious school, what does Noah bring to the world?
It's like a second chance or a generation.
Okay, that's good. So it's a rebirth. It's an attempt to reform the world. Huh? Faith. Okay, good. We're not sure what Noah's faith was. We know he liked to drink a lot. Kiddush was an important part of Noah's life.
He was a caretaker for all the life that he had with him on the ark. So some sort of back.
Okay.
Listen to God.
Listening to God, all right. Okay,
I have a question about Noah.
good.
Actually, about all of that, Elohim.
Uh-huh.
Somebody was not sitting there writing all this down while it was going on. Who invented these people?
Well, that's a great question. You know, I'm a student of the Torah. I love to read the text. There are some things we don't know. Now, the traditional interpretation is Moses is on Mount Sinai. He's up there for a long time. God tells him the whole story, from Adam to the end, to Moses' own death. And Moses writes it down. That's the traditional interpretation. That everything that happened before Moses, God told Moses about, and Moses wrote it down just as God told him. Right? That's an interesting thought. You know, makes sense. You know, there's a lot of other philosophies out there. There are those who would say that the Torah in its entirety, you know, from Moses, from creation through Moses, is written by 4 different schools of thought. And those 4 schools of thought independently wrote stories and created events. And then someone, a great editor, or the big R redactor, took all those 4 stories, blended them all together into one text. And that process happened about 400 years after Moses, really around the time of Solomon, sometime after David. And that's another traditional kind of view. It comes out of the German Wissenschaft des Judentums, or the science of Judaism. A couple of guys, non-Jews, Graf and Wellhausen, created this philosophy based on these 4 schools of thought. That's great. Can't prove a whit of it. My first Bible class in HUC, we actually had books. We had to go out and buy a new Bible, in Hebrew, of course. And we had to buy 4 colors of highlighters. And every day at the beginning of class, the professor would write down 4 sections on the board, and there we were, coloring with the highlighter. 4 sections, you know, in graduate school, coloring, you know. And so by the end of the semester, we had a 4-color Bible. And he would say if you read all the yellow portions, that was J. And if you read all the red portions, that was P. And each one would kind of, you know, follow a stream of thought based upon the philosophy of that particular school. So all the J's referred to God as Adonai. All the E sections referred to God as Elohim. What's the difference between Adonai and Elohim? We have absolutely no clue. But there's a difference. We don't know why they chose the name they chose. We could make up a whole lot of stories, which is what Judaism has done. But ultimately, we don't know. All the priestly sections fit together very neatly. And then there's Deuteronomy. Kind of Moses' own words, you know, the big grand conclusion, the essence of the Torah was its own school. There were those who would say, well, when Moses died, he basically handed the book of Deuteronomy to Joshua. Right? He didn't hand a whole Torah. He handed a book of Deuteronomy, all the kind of the unique wisdom that he had created, he had gleaned. And then, you know, the conquest and the kingdoms, and then sometime over here, these other 3 schools kind of wrote their text. And then they all blended together. And suddenly, poof, there was a Torah. Which belief is right? as I've always approached the text, for me, it doesn't matter where it comes from. Even if we accept the fact that it began right here. So for 4,000 years or 3,000 years, we've had the same text. To me, that's important. So whether it's Genesis was back there, or here, or there, or by this person or that person, ultimately, to my theology, is irrelevant. What's more important is, I got the Torah, what do I do with it? Do I leave it in the ark and call it pretty, decorate it up nice, and never take it out? Or do I take it out, read it, learn from it, and try to engage it in my life? And that's been my approach. With me, that's what's more important than whose signature is on the bottom line. So, let's see, big distraction. Let's see, Noah. So we're back to Noah. And so Noah brings, actually the gift, the greatest gift Noah brings is the covenant. It has nothing to do with the flood or the ark, or the saving of the duck-billed platypus or a giraffe. It has everything to do with the very first written covenant between God and man. See, there was kind of a law, first law one could claim, or first mitzvah, was given to Adam. Be fruitful and multiply. He failed miserably at that. All right? But the covenant, this set of laws that Noah received, really becomes valid for not only Noah, but other peoples. And all the people that kind of congregated where Noah might have been, become engaged in this covenant. This covenant comes from a reading of Genesis chapter 9. And they're called the 7 Noahide laws. And there are those who will claim that in order to get a portion of the world to come, all you have to do is be a good Noahide. Follow the covenant of Noah. You're cool. Well, but here's what's in the covenant of Noah. No idol worship. No blasphemy. No murder. No theft. No adultery. No cannibalism, which means eating the limb or meat or anything of a live animal. And set up courts of justice. And those 9 laws, if you followed those 9 laws, you're a righteous person. And you have a place. And that's the first historical covenant, Noah. But as we know, covenants are going to grow. Because the next generation brings us to Abraham. And what does Abraham have to offer? Tell me Abraham's story. Someone. What do you know?
He kills idols. He breaks idols.
Okay, breaks idols. Good midrash.
Follows God's direction.
All right? God says go this way, he goes that way. All right? What else is in Abraham's story? Circumcision. Yeah. That's a big piece of it. What else? I woke you up, Michael. What else is a part of Abraham's story? This is something that nobody really thinks about. Abraham is the first person in the text who has an encounter with God and his name changes. So when we think about Abraham, we think about transformation. How do we transform ourselves? And historically, Abraham brings the idea that we can. We can change. And so Abraham has an encounter. His name is Abram. But Abram was limited. Abram was no more possible than Noah to inherit the future. Avraham was greater than Abram. He becomes something more. Because once Abraham becomes the father of 2 children, he becomes the progenitor of a multitude of nations. And that marks his change. And the only way for him to become that father of a multitude of nations is for him to listen and follow God. And he does that. And historically, Abraham, well, he moves, he's a nomad. He is, moving from, kind of northern Syria, southern Turkey, along the Fertile Crescent, down through the Jordan River Valley, all the way south to the Negev, and then he continues on into Egypt. He is not always a righteous guy. Even though we see Avraham as, one of the greats, we say, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzhak. We see Abraham as the great Jew, monotheist, first Jew in the world. Doesn't always behave right. Sometimes he bends the truth. Like when he tells Pharaoh that Sarai is his sister.
When did he change his name? What was the event?
So his name changes after the birth of Isaac. When Ishmael is all there is, he's the father of one nation. But when Isaac is born, he becomes the father of a multitude of nations.
So Ram means multitude?
So the H, the hey in the word, right, so that becomes the key to a multitude of nations. Avram, Avraham, Haim means them. So Av, father, Rachem, multiple wounds. So that's how he gets to that name. And so Abraham's path is important because, different from Noah, what did Abraham do that was different than Noah? Testing your biblical knowledge.
At some point he argues with God.
Exactly. You got it. So when God tells Noah, build an ark, I'm destroying the world, everyone on it's going to die except you and your family, Noah pulls out a hammer and a nail and starts building. Never bothers to ask God a question like, why are you going to do it? Or are you sure you want to do that? Abraham is the first when God says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham says, why? What if there's a righteous person there? And so Abraham brings to the covenantal relationship a response. The covenant is no longer just listening. We have to participate. History becomes not passive, but active. We can rewrite history through our encounter in a covenantal dialogue with God. So we have covenant, and here we have dialogue. And that dialogue is going to grow with the next stage. Again, 10 generations later. So we're 10, 10, 10, and now 10. We're going to get to Moses. In between Abraham and Moses, there's a whole lot of stuff that goes on. It's almost as if time slows down. Because we have to get from Abraham to Moses. And the only jump can't be Egypt. It has to be family. So we have to have Isaac and Jacob's sons, and disaffection and disconnection, because all of that is essential to building the opportunity for Moses to jump from dysfunctional family, that's what Genesis is about, to a functional people. And so Moses to Abraham, what Moses brings that is different than Abraham is what? What does Moses bring?
Leadership.
Okay. He's leader, great.
10 Commandments.
10 Commandments. Covenant takes on a new word or a new concept so we have 10 Commandments, we have leadership. What else do we have?
Isn't it the whole plan for the Israeli nation, people?
Okay, a plan. Although Moses doesn't really know the plan, all God says is, I want you to go to Pharaoh and get my people out. Moses doesn't really know what that means. The plan kind of unfolds as the drama of the Exodus. So I don't know that God said to Moses, hey, come over here, I'm in the burning bush. I got this plan for you, I want you to look at it. And God draws this big diagram on the blackboard and says, follow this. I don't think we get that. I think what we get is a whole lot of faith that there's some meaning to the voice for Moses.
He also brings some, the isolation, like a cleansing.
Okay? So if we take the transformation, so each one of these, Noah and Abraham and Moses, they all are transformative people. And each one is changing. So Noah changes, right? Because Noah was the most righteous of his generation, but the rabbis say they don't even know how bad he was because everybody else was so much worse. He could have been a real stunk, and he could have just, smiled once and been the most righteous for all we know. But he was a transformative figure in that he brought this covenant. Abraham was transformative. Right? Because Abraham took himself from everything he knew into the nothingness, into the liminal, if you will, the space that was created between what he knew, his father's world, and the world where God was leading him. He didn't know where that was. Abraham's walking along one day and God says, stop. Look north, south, east, and west. Everything's yours. Abraham says, cool. And then he begins to settle the land. But Abraham didn't know where that place was. Because he may have never been that far south. Suddenly he woke up and God said, hey, look, it's all yours. What God didn't say is, oh, and by the way, there's some people living there that you have to get rid of. But that's a whole other story. And then we get to Moses, who is himself transformed. So he's Egyptian, but he's Jewish. But he doesn't really know what Jewish is. Because he didn't really know he was Jewish until he had a feeling that he was Jewish. If you follow the story, he has a sudden rage when he sees a Jew being attacked. And so he lashes out, and then he finds out that his mother's been hiding in the closet, his Levitical blanket. And she says, oh yeah, by the way. And Moses doesn't get angry. He just gets proud that he has this identity. So he goes from second in command in Egypt to someone with this past that he doesn't know anything about. And he himself is transformed through faith and relationship. So he's walking along in the wilderness, and he's at Mount Sinai, and he sees the burning bush, and suddenly he hears a voice that he's never heard before, and he instantly knows that it's God. And God says, take your shoes off, and he does. And God says, my people are suffering. And Moses says, I know. Does he know? Maybe he does. And God says, go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. And Moses' response is, you're not the right guy, God. I'm not eloquent. Pick someone else. And God says, no, I'm going to pick you. Now, where's the history in all of this? It's not there. Now, it was Bruce Feiler who did this whole, all of his work on walking the Bible and talking the Bible and eating the Bible and all kinds of things like that. And all along the way, he's trying to find Mount Sinai. And Bruce, I know Bruce, he's a Southerner, and so he's telling the story one day, and he determines, he says in the end of the book, that the real Mount Sinai is this radar station in Saudi Arabia that he tried to get to, but the Saudis won't let him up there because it's a military radar station, and they knew it was Mount Sinai, and that's why they put the radar station up there to prevent the Jews from getting there and celebrating that it was Mount Sinai. And he and a whole bunch of archaeologists are convinced that that's the real Mount Sinai, and all this nonsense about a monastery in the southern Sinai Peninsula is bad directions. And so, but there's no archaeological evidence and no proof that there ever was a Mount Sinai or that there is a Mount Sinai. It's all a faith story. So there's a dimension, a huge dimension in this period of time about faith and history, or faith and prehistory. Because ultimately, our faith has to get us through this time so that we can get to where history actually begins. Otherwise, just history begins. Suddenly there's a king. And then there's a temple. And there's a Torah. And there's a priesthood and a sacrifice and a whole structure. And it exists suddenly if there's no prehistory describing how faith leads one to practice. And that's what all of this is. And the Exodus is the essential piece. Because we have to have a cause. We have to have a reason. And the reason is, why did we come out of Egypt? To worship. What's the claim? Let my people go for 3 days. For only first for 1 day, so that they can worship God free. Pharaoh says, no, no, yes, no, no, yes, no, no, yes. And then Moses says, well, if you're not going to let us go for 1 day, you're going to let us go for 3 days. Because now it's a farther walk because we've been in slavery for longer. And so now it's 3 days. So now it's no, no, yes, no, no, yes. And then the plagues come, which are, where's the historical evidence of plagues? If you have, I lived in Cincinnati, rabbinic school was in Cincinnati. And Cincinnati has the 17-year cicadas. Now, I don't know if they have them around here, but if you've never seen them, it's like unbelievable. So I think my junior year, or 4th year of rabbinic school, and it was the 17-year cicadas. And life was great and grand, and then one day we came out and the sidewalk was covered. I've never seen, I grew up in Texas, I'm used to roaches. I've never seen cicadas like this, just covering the ground. You walk and they just fly into you and stick and hang out. And you're walking down the street like this because it's like thick. And I can imagine what Egypt could have been like had those cicadas been there. So what was funny about the story is that so my wife Dora was there, and she said, "I will never come back anywhere where there's 17-year cicadas." 17 years from that year, my daughter was invited to a bat mitzvah in Cincinnati. And it was the weekend of the 17 years of marriage. And they were there. The car was covered. You drove down the street crunching, it was unbelievable. Never seen anything like it. But, this faith story is so important. And if we accept it as a faith story, it lays the groundwork for true history. If we try to find the historical validity of it, we get lost in the absence of evidence. And as I said in my sermon last week, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And so the traditional Jewish approach is just because you can't prove it doesn't mean it happened or didn't happen that way. We have the Bible, that's a good resource. Isn't the Bible true? Isn't this truth? And there will be a whole lot of people who will say absolutely yes. This is truth. Even though there's no evidence that it's true. It's a faith story.
Is there any evidence contrary to the Bible?
No, there's not. Well, there is the evidence of, were there 600,000 people walking down the street, they would leave a rut. They would leave some trash. There would be some pottery. If the Dead Sea Scrolls can survive for 2,000 years in a cave in the Dead Sea area, can't pottery, survive? They survived. The scrolls survived intact. Couldn't pottery survive? And I don't know the answer to that question. You know, I don't know if a piece of pottery left in the open in the middle of a desert is going to still exist 2,800 years later. All right? But what we do know is that there's no mass burial sites, there's no animal bones, you know, there aren't, now there's attempts, and every now and then some archaeologist or some scientist comes and says, oh, if you look under this water this way and see way down in this crack, you'll find something. And so there's a whole lot of popular archaeology trying to prove the historicity of this moment. But for Jewish history, it's really irrelevant because it's a faith story. It's not historical. Could have been 40 Jews in a wagon. But they wrote about it and they made it a huge moment. And it was a transformational moment, and it changed forever the relationship that humanity, Jewish humanity, had with God. And so this covenant that became the Noah laws, and this covenant, the Ten Commandments, become essential pieces in that historical birth of a people. And what happens next is equally important. Because the 40 years of wandering, and 40 is a religious number, it has no real timeline significance. Other than we see the number 40 representing the number of maturity. So 40, the flood was 40 days and 40 nights, maturing the earth, cleansing the earth, that the generations of Noah to Abraham are 40 years a generation, times 10. From Abraham to Noah, another 40 years times 10. But we see this number growing over and over again. And finally we get to Moses, and he's 40 when he leaves Egypt. He's 40 years in the wilderness. He's 80 when he comes back to lead the Jews to safety, and he's 120 when he dies, all multiples of 40. And so the number 40 becomes significant. And it becomes significant in Judaism because it says, you're not supposed to study mysticism until you're 40 because you're not mature enough. You're not grounded enough. You're not, you're not knowledgeable enough of basic Jewish teachings to take that next step. But the number 40 even gets picked up in Christianity and Islam. That it took 40 days from Muhammad to journey from Mecca to Medina. It was 40 days for Jesus' journey. Lent is 40 days, and you don't count the Sundays. It's like the number 40 comes up over and over and over again in this period of time. Because we really do see a faith story getting intertwined with relationship building. And so Moses leads us into the wilderness, and then through the wilderness to the land. And the next person along the path is Joshua. And what do we know about Joshua? Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, good. Those children's songs still stick with us, all right? But what do we know about Joshua before Jericho? Joshua was one of the 12 spies. He and Caleb were the 2 spies that came back with a positive report that no one listened to. So the Israelites had to wander for 40 years. And Joshua is always at the right hand of Moses. And he's kind of handpicked by God and is told by God, Joshua, Moses is going to pass on the leadership to you. The text of Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers, or chapters of the fathers, which is a part of the Talmud, says the transmission of Torah was handed from Moses to Joshua, from Joshua to the elders, and so on. That clearly there was this oral retelling as well as a written document. It was passed on at this time from Moses to Joshua and Joshua beyond. That's an important step in the transformation of this people. When we look to the next stage, we're going to look at a map. So Joshua is charged with finding the homeland of the Jews and taking them across to conquer the land of Canaan. Now, if you look at the map, you'll see that these 12 tribes are the 12 tribes at the time of Joshua. And all of the lighter colored areas were places or habitations of other communities. So Joshua is really charged not only with leading the Israelites into the land of Israel, but displacing those tribes and cultures and peoples that were already there. So it was not an easy transition. The gates weren't just opened up and we sauntered in. It was a war. Anyone who's read the book of Joshua, it reads like one of the more violent war journals that one could ever read. It's battle after battle against cultures and peoples to get to this place where we can settle the land. You know, what's happened is that we've come up from Egypt through wanderings till we get to somewhere around the middle of the Jordan River Valley, and Joshua is going to take us in so that we enter to to Jericho. Jericho is where the first battle was fought. 2.5 tribes decide it's in their best interest to hang out in Jordan. And the other 9.5 tribes hang out in the land. And each one creates their place. Next biblical test. What's unique about the tribes? What's unique? So everything up until this point has been people. Am Yisrael. We're all a people. We're following Moses. We're following Joshua. We're all together. Every tribe works together with the other tribes. Suddenly, we're going to divide up into places, into groups, distinct and separate from one another. One tribe can't marry another tribe. Right? If you marry someone from another tribe, that tribe loses their land. And so that can't happen because the tribe has to own the territory. And so suddenly this peoplehood that's developed in the kind of the popular telling of the Exodus story really isn't there. And when it all boils down, we're a bunch of tribes, separate and distinct. And if you're from Manasseh, you marry someone from Manasseh. And if you're from Issachar, you better marry someone from Issachar. Or else, if you marry someone from Manasseh, your family loses their land. And it's up to Manasseh if they want to give you any.
Why, on Shabbat, when we bless sons, do we only mention those two tribes?
Ephraim and Manasseh.
Yeah.
So Ephraim and Manasseh were the sons of Joseph. Joseph gets a double portion. So in essence, we're saying, may you be blessed as Joseph, because you get a double portion. So, and then, for a girl, it's Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, because, which one are you going to pick? But Ephraim and Manasseh is the double portion for Joseph. So these 12 tribes, they settle in their homes. They settle in their lands. And history begins at this time. Right? Because from a scientific historical perspective, it's very hard to document the wanderings of the landless people. Right? So you have this people just wandering through the wilderness. They're not leaving a whole lot of trash around. There's no evidence. Nobody's really recording where we are, who we are, why we are. Which gives a whole lot of credence to the idea that maybe we're not talking about 600,000 people. We're really talking about maybe 600 people. Or maybe 6,000 people. But not 600,000. Right? Because if we were 600,000 plus women and children, someone would have noticed. Someone would have written a letter to their cousin saying, guess what I saw today? Right? But nobody writes down anything, which runs counter to the whole human condition, especially at that time of life, because people wrote down when they saw mass migrations. Something was happening. That would have been news. 600,000 people marching by your front door. But they didn't write it down. So we don't know what the number was. And so we suddenly appear in the land and we have space and we have place. And the next step is purpose. And what's the purpose? What's our purpose? When suddenly we have a historical presence, what's our purpose? What do we do next? It's all about Jerusalem. Once we have our place, we have to have. Our purpose is no longer getting from point A to point B. We're at point B. And now we have another purpose, and the purpose is to establish our faith system. It's the birth of the priesthood. It's the building of the temple. It's the storm and drum of faith. And it begins with a question. And the question is, when you have a bunch of tribes, how are you going to control them? And what do the tribes want? They want a king. All these other peoples that we've defeated along the way, they had kings. We've defeated them, but we need a king to keep us strong, to keep us connected. And what does Samuel say? It's going to be a slippery slope, take you down the wrong path. You have a king. Who's your king? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Holy One is your king. All right? If you try to pursue a human king, Samuel says, you're going to end up like all those people you defeated along the way. Because you will be defeated. But the people said, we don't want to hear that. We want a human king. And who did they get? Saul. They get a guy named Saul. Saul is not a good king. Starts off okay, but he's very distrusting. And he's a strong king. He's a fighter. And we know the story. Saul and his soldiers are going into battle. And they're going to battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines hire a mercenary. And the mercenary's name was Goliath of Gath. Right? Gath is a coastal town in the Mediterranean. And they hired this guy Goliath. Why did they hire Goliath? Because he was a big guy. And it says in the text that his bed was 9 cubits long and 6 cubits wide, and makes a California king look like a twin size. And he filled the whole bed. So what's a cubit? 1.5 feet. So this guy was huge. And as we know the story, all of the Israelites were afraid. And when David, this little shepherd boy, hears the plight and runs up with his slingshot, hits Goliath between the eyes of the rock, he falls to the ground, and David takes Goliath's sword, which was probably 4 times his size, and cuts his head off. And the battle with the Philistines for that time is over. And David becomes a folk hero. And Saul becomes very distrusting of David. First he embraces him, brings him into his home, introduces him to his son Jonathan. They're going to make a happy family, and takes David away from his family. David was kind of the chief assistant for the prophet Samuel, but Saul kind of takes him away from Samuel, and then Saul starts feeling that a little paranoid that David's going to take away his claim to the kingdom. And what happens next in Samuel is great. I would encourage you, if you ever have a chance, to read the book of Samuel. Because it's all about civil war. You know, we think the Civil War between the North and the South was bad. Try the Civil War between the two tribes of Jerusalem and the 10 tribes outside. Within our own people, there was a civil war to put the U.S. Civil War to shame. And it went on for generations. It wasn't 40 years, it was 40 years of civil war. And there were times of calm when the two sides came together. And then something would happen and the war would start up again. And it was ugly, and it was violent, and whole towns were decimated. And you know, it's part of our own history that we don't read very often because we don't like that part of our history. So then, after this kind of siege between Saul and David, what happens? Jonathan chooses a side. Jonathan, who is Saul's son, who is the heir apparent to Saul's kingdom, chooses David over Saul. There's a whole subtext as to why Jonathan chose David. There's some rabbinic kind of discussion of that David and Jonathan had a love relationship, a homosexual relationship, and that Saul told Jonathan if he ever saw David to tell Saul because Saul was going to kill him. Because Saul was afraid that David was going to take away his throne. And Jonathan chooses David. Saul kills Jonathan, kills his own son to preserve his kingdom. And David ultimately, no, not David, but someone of David's army ultimately kills Saul. And David becomes king. And it would be great if the story stopped there. But David's not a great king either. Because David had his downfalls. And what were they? What do we know about David? Bathsheba, women, all right? He was a player, you know, and the text says he was out one day on this balcony and he looked down and Bathsheba was sunbathing and he said, I want that. And then he finds out that Bathsheba is married, and so his response was to send her husband to the front. All right? And he was killed. Did David kill Uriah? You know, it could be the case. Is it historical? We don't know. Is it important? Well, it cuts to the character of the kings. The kings were, and the period of the kings was a very dark time for the Jews because Samuel was right. What God wanted from us was acknowledgement of the King of Kings and not to chase human kings. That human power was non-existent and had, you know, from Samuel's perspective and then subsequent prophets, had we simply stuck to the belief in God and followed the path that Moses and Torah had set out, then we would have been much further along than we ever got. Okay. David, who became king? Who was king after David? Solomon. Now, David's greatest desire was to build the temple, to build a palace to God's glory. But God never let him build the temple. Why?
Killed.
He had blood on his hands. He was a fighter. He led a whole lot of military conquest. And it wasn't because of Uriah, as a lot of people suggest, because of the sin of Bathsheba. It was really because he was a military victor, military leader. And that was important for him to be that way. But that prevented him from putting his signature on the building of the temple. So Solomon is chosen after David's death to build the temple in Jerusalem. And Solomon was noted for what? What do we know about Solomon? He was wisdom. He was wise.
Psalms.
Okay. He wrote a lot of a lot of the Psalms are associated with David. Some of them are also associated with Solomon. There is a text in the Apocrypha called the Wisdom of Solomon. There is also the Song of Solomon, which is another extra biblical text. What else do we know?
About the wives.
Right. He had lots of wives. Why did he have lots of wives? Right. It brought power. Expanding the kingdom. Every time Solomon married someone else, he became the recipient of that kingdom's wealth. So Solomon used all of this wealth to build the temple. The temple at Solomon's time was gold-laden, covered in gold. Everything was gold. All the implements, everything surrounding the temple was filled with wealth. In many ways, it was like the Vatican on steroids. And Solomon used that wealth to show the people that he was in control. But as we know, at the end of Solomon's reign, when there was no clear successor, the Solomonic country dissolved. And what followed Solomon was a division, north and south, tribe against tribe, king against king, and temple against temple. And much of the wealth of Solomon's temple was carried off by the nations around it, not by the north or the south. As Solomon built the temple, there was relative peace. People, cultures, communities. Josephus, who was a historian, wrote that kings and priests and representatives of all the faith systems and pagan cultures around the temple, around Jerusalem, sent tributes to Jerusalem. The biggest problem Solomon had was that in marrying so many women, he was required to build for each of them a deity, a place for their deity to reside. And so instead of Solomon maintaining the purity of Jerusalem, devoted to God, he created shrines and idols to other faith systems for his wives to use. And that polluted the faith of Jerusalem and led to its ultimate demise in 586. So we covered a lot. Like I said, it's a crash course. I don't see any heads on the table yet. But let's go down our list to see how we did on our questions for lesson 1. So the first Jew was Abraham. Isaac was to Ishmael as Jacob was to Esau. Good. They were brothers. Jacob's first wife was Leah. Correct. He thought he was marrying Rachel, but Laban was a tricky sort and put her in a veil and put Leah in her place. Joseph accused his brothers of being thieves. Good. He put a goblet in one of their bags when they came to buy grain. Moses' sister was Miriam, helped the Jewish nation in the wilderness. What was she known for in the wilderness? Finding water. She was a well witch. In other words, there was a well. Miriam's well followed her wherever she went, which created a problem when she talked bad against Moses, because she was kicked out of the camp, and the people thought that they would lose their water source because Miriam was kicked out of the camp, and so they prayed to God to heal her from her leprosy. And that was the first prayer for healing. And the people had an interest in it, though, because they wanted to make sure they didn't lose the water.
At our Seder, we have Miriam's
Moses was a great leader because he had a lot of interesting question. The answer is D, compassion. He was not charismatic at all. Remember, he said he stammered and stuttered, and he wasn't the right person. Unlike Charlton Heston in the movie. Jewish people received the Torah at Mount Sinai. The 10 spies told the Jewish people that the land of Israel was barren. Actually, they said it devoured its inhabitants. That the land of Israel would devour its inhabitants. They didn't say it was a land flowing with milk and honey, all of them. But 10 of them said it would devour its inhabitants. They were afraid of the conquest. Jews traveled in the wilderness for 40 years. Who led the Jews into the land of Egypt, land of Israel? Joshua. Initially, after the Israelites settled in Canaan, they were led by, who were the first leaders? The judges, right. Deborah and judges of her kind. The first king of Israel was Saul, and the first temple was built by Solomon. Okay. So next week we'll work on lesson 2, which is going to take us through this period of time from the time of Solomon, after the time of Solomon, through the destruction. So the division of the kingdoms, the infighting, the understanding of what makes a kingdom good, bad, what makes a good king. How do you define a good king in a world where all kings are bad, according to our tradition? Now I have for you some interesting pieces. Some of these come from the material that the National Jewish Outreach Program put together. And this is a timeline. It has kind of the first two columns. The first column is the year from the Jewish calendar perspective, starting with 0 and going to 5774. The second column is the year in the civil calendar. So, you're counting down 1976 BCE. Why do we use BCE and CE? What is it? Huh? All right. So we wouldn't use Anno Domini or BC before Christ because it's not important to us. So Anno Domini would be year of our Lord, which ain't our Lord, so we wouldn't use that term. So BCE is before the Common Era, and CE is the Common Era. So, some interesting pieces in that timeline. This next document is just an interesting overview of the history of Judaism. And I'm not, you don't have to, you can read these, you don't have to read them. We're not going to really be referring to them. I would, if I were you, bring the map. So the map and the test. If you're, that's the test. Yeah.
The kingdoms that were conquered by the tribes so that they could then you mentioned that there were kings there. Were these small kingdoms? We're not up to the empires, the famous empires yet.
Right.
So
Right.
the concept of unifying everybody in the world under one thing is not there yet.
No. That is correct. And actually, if you read the text of Joshua, we're told we're not supposed to make friends with them. We're not supposed to encounter them on any level. We're supposed to completely obliterate them. And what the problem that created is that the Jews lost heart. And when they came to the Canaanites, they could never eliminate the Canaanites. By choice, they chose not to purge the land, which created a constant thorn in the side of every king from then on, because there were these peoples, indigenous peoples, who had somehow a claim to the land that ran counter to the claims of the kings. So this we're not going to need for a couple of weeks. This is an interesting list of people. I put this together a few years ago. All of when we get especially to this period around the Talmud, there are so many players and people and thoughts and teachings at play that I thought it was always good to have a scorecard. And so this kind of lists all of these names, some of which are familiar, some of which you've never heard of and will never hear from. But these are all the Talmudic, rabbinic leaders, figures from basically 200 BC to the Middle Ages. And so they're really, it's really just an interesting list. And we'll talk about what these names across the top mean. Zugot, Tanaim, Amoraim, Savoraim. These are all classes of leadership. And they're defined by the dates. So the Zugot are the oldest. And here's the catch. For Rabbinic Judaism, if someone who was a Zugat, one of these, Zugot means pairs, so you have like two rabbinic figures together that serve as leaders. So if someone was one of those and they said something, what they said was more valuable than anything that could have ever been said since then. So for Orthodox Judaism, the older the authority, the more valuable the position. Reform Judaism says exactly the opposite. The newer the authority, the more information they have to make a decision. And so therefore, that's the balance. That's how you understand how there's a heterology between Reform and Orthodoxy. Because we are looking at the same question from two different perspectives. And we are looking for the newest, greatest, most advanced view of that issue instead of the oldest, purest, simplest view of that issue. And that's how we get distinctiveness or dissimilarity between us on the same topic. And it's just an interesting exercise to try to figure that out. So, tonight we learned about 2,500 years. And so at this point I'm going to say, do you have any questions?